Knitting, one of the oldest forms of textile creation, has evolved dramatically from its humble origins to become both a practical craft and a rich art form. Its story spans thousands of years and mirrors humanity's cultural, economic, and technological advancements. This narrative traces the fascinating journey of knitting from its ancient roots to the high-tech innovations of today, blending history, craftsmanship, and modern creativity. Knitting likely originated in the Middle East between the 5th and 7th centuries CE. However, some archaeological evidence suggests earlier forms of loop textile making techniques, such as knalbinding, may have laid the groundwork for knitting's eventual development. Unlike woven fabric, which is made from a network of vertical and horizontal threads, knitting involves looping a single thread into a series of interconnected loops. This technique allowed for greater flexibility and stretch in fabric, which was ideal for garments like socks and hats. The oldest known surviving knitted artifacts were found in Egypt, made of fine cotton and wool, dating back to the 11th century CE. These items, including intricate socks with decorative designs, hint at knitting's initial use as both a functional and aesthetic craft. Knitting quickly spread to other regions via trade routes, with different cultures developing their own distinctive styles and patterns. For example, Islamic knitting traditions introduced intricate colorwork and geometric motifs, while European knitters adapted the craft to colder climates by producing heavier, warmer garments. The Middle Ages and the Renaissance were pivotal in knitting's spread and refinement. By the 14th century, knitting had made its way into Europe, where it rapidly gained popularity among both the aristocracy and common folk. The advent of guilds in cities like Paris and London in the 15th century allowed knitting to flourish as a professional trade. Knitted goods, particularly hosiery, became a staple of fashion, and skilled knitters were highly regarded for their craftsmanship. The complexity of patterns grew, with designs incorporating cables, lace, and colorwork. During the 16th century, Queen Elizabeth I of England famously received a pair of fine knitted silk stockings, which sparked a trend among the upper class for luxurious knitted garments. As knitting spread across Europe, regional styles developed, such as the intricate Aran sweaters of Ireland, with their symbolic patterns, and the Shetland lace of Scotland. Knitting also became a means of economic survival for many communities, particularly during times of hardship. Fishermen's families, for example, often knitted woolen sweaters, socks, and caps to protect against the harsh weather at sea. These garments, while practical, were also deeply embedded with cultural significance, often passed down through generations. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries marked a significant turning point in the history of knitting. The invention of the knitting machine in 1589 by William Lee was an early precursor to industrial knitting, but it wasn't until the technological advancements of the Industrial Revolution that knitting moved from a predominantly handcraft industry to a mechanized one. With the development of steam power and the widespread use of machines, knitting factories were established, producing large quantities of knitted fabric at an unprecedented speed. This led to the mass production of knitwear, making garments more affordable and accessible to a wider population. However, hand knitting did not disappear. Instead, it took on new roles as a leisure activity and a form of artistic expression. The 19th century also saw the rise of knitting patterns and instructional books, which allowed individuals to learn and create their own knitwear at home. The publication of knitting patterns democratized the craft, enabling women, in particular, to produce fashionable garments in the comfort of their own homes. This era also witnessed knitting being used as a patriotic activity during times of war. During World War I and II, civilians were encouraged to knit socks, scarves, and other items for soldiers, fostering a sense of community and support for the war effort. In the mid-20th century, knitting underwent another transformation, with new fibers and styles influencing the craft. The introduction of synthetic fibers like nylon and acrylic in the 1930s and 1940s revolutionized knitting by providing cheaper alternatives to natural fibers such as wool, cotton, and silk. These man-made fibers were easier to care for, more durable, and widely accessible. The post-war era saw knitting rise in popularity as a domestic hobby, with women's magazines and pattern books promoting knitting as both fashionable and practical. Television shows and celebrities helped bring knitting into mainstream culture, showcasing intricate designs and modern styles. At the same time, traditional techniques were preserved in rural areas, where knitting remained a vital skill for creating everyday clothing. The countercultural movements of the 1960s and 1970s further revitalized knitting, with the craft becoming part of the handmade ethos. Colorful, experimental designs were embraced, and knitting became a symbol of rebellion against mass-produced, corporate fashion. The knitting revival during this period also saw a return to natural fibers, as environmental consciousness grew, and crafters sought sustainable, eco-friendly materials. Today, knitting stands at the intersection of tradition and innovation. The 21st century has brought about a resurgence of interest in handcrafts, fueled by a growing appreciation for slow fashion and sustainability. Knitting has benefited from this movement, with new generations of knitters embracing the craft as both a practical skill and a form of creative expression. The internet has played a crucial role in the modern knitting renaissance, with online communities, pattern-sharing platforms like Ravelry, and video tutorials making it easier than ever to learn and improve knitting skills. Social media has allowed knitters to connect across the globe, sharing projects, techniques, and inspiration. Advances in technology have also transformed knitting. Modern knitting machines, which can be operated by computer, allow for intricate patterns and designs that would be difficult or impossible to achieve by hand. These machines have expanded the possibilities for commercial knitwear, enabling designers to push the boundaries of texture, form, and color. Additionally, innovations in materials science have led to the development of high-tech fibers, such as moisture-wicking yarns, antimicrobial yarns, and even yarns that change color with temperature. These advancements are not only enhancing the functionality of knitted garments but also expanding knitting's role in fields like sportswear, medicine, and environmental conservation. Knitting, once a simple craft for warmth and necessity, has become a complex art form that reflects the values and innovations of each era. Its journey from ancient handcraft to modern-day tech-enhanced creativity highlights the adaptability and enduring appeal of knitting. As both a cultural touchstone and a platform for future innovations, knitting continues to evolve, blending tradition with cutting-edge techniques to meet the needs of contemporary society. Whether as a hobby, a profession, or a symbol of sustainability and self-expression, knitting remains a timeless thread that connects us to our past while knitting the fabric of our future. Knitting's history is as much about people and communities as it is about yarn and techniques. In its early days, knitting served practical purposes and was a communal activity that often defined the identity of regions and groups. In isolated villages across Europe, knitting circles were a staple of daily life, where generations would pass down patterns and techniques that held cultural significance. The Shetland Islands, for example, were renowned for their intricate lace knitting. The designs, passed from mother to daughter, symbolized the islanders' connection to their land and heritage. Each stitch pattern told a story, some represented local flora, while others depicted historical events or family traditions. Knitting was often a collective activity, and communities took pride in their unique styles. The Irish Aran sweater, now iconic, was originally made by fishing families on the Aran Islands. Each clan developed its own signature cable pattern, which became a marker of family identity. Over time, the sweater evolved from a functional garment to a symbol of Irish heritage. It is these personal, familial connections to knitting that have kept the craft alive across centuries, even as mass production of textiles grew. Knitting also played a pivotal role in wartime efforts, not only in Europe but around the world. During World War I, the Red Cross called on civilians to contribute to the war effort by knitting socks, sweaters, and scarves for soldiers. Woolen goods were essential in keeping troops warm in cold, damp trenches, and knitting became a patriotic duty for women, children, and even men who were unable to serve. The "Knitting for Victory" movement was born, uniting people of all ages and backgrounds in a common cause. In World War II, the call to knit for soldiers continued, with civilians across the Allied nations knitting tirelessly to support troops stationed abroad. Knitting patterns were often distributed by governments, and knitters would send their finished products to war relief agencies. Beyond the practical benefits, the knitting campaigns also had a psychological impact, helping to boost morale by giving people at home a tangible way to contribute to the war effort. The knitting done during these times was often simple but highly effective, showcasing knitting's ability to meet urgent needs. The sense of camaraderie fostered by these knitting efforts continued even after the wars ended, influencing the rise of knitting groups in the mid-20th century. The post-war boom of the 1950s and 1960s marked a turning point in the perception of knitting. In many Western countries, knitting became more of a leisure activity than a necessity, as mass-produced clothing became affordable and widely available. The rise of department stores and fast fashion diminished the practical need for home knitting. However, instead of fading away, knitting adapted to the changing cultural landscape. It became a symbol of domesticity, and women's magazines of the time often featured knitting patterns for fashionable cardigans, baby clothes, and accessories. Knitting during this period was viewed as a wholesome and productive hobby, often passed down from mother to daughter. The patterns from the 1950s and 1960s were also reflective of the era's sleek, streamlined styles, with close-fitting sweaters and knit dresses becoming popular wardrobe staples. Though knitting remained popular, the growing availability of synthetic fabrics and factory-produced clothing meant that hand-knitted items became less common in everyday wear. Instead, knitting was seen more as a creative outlet, with knitters experimenting with color, texture, and design for personal satisfaction rather than necessity. By the late 20th century, knitting had experienced a revival, driven by several cultural shifts. In the 1970s, the counter-cultural and feminist movements embraced knitting as part of the broader DIY, do-it-yourself, ethos. In contrast to the post-war domestic image of knitting, the craft was now seen as a form of self-expression and even political statement. Feminists, in particular, reclaimed knitting as a symbol of women's creativity and power. They challenged traditional gender roles by using knitting to create bold, colorful, and unconventional items. The craft became part of the Back to Nature movement, where handmade goods were valued over mass-produced ones. Many knitters began to experiment with natural fibers and hand-dyed yarns, exploring the organic textures and vibrant hues that mass production could not replicate. The resurgence of knitting also saw the rise of knitting co-ops and collectives, where crafters shared techniques and patterns, fostering a sense of community. Knitting became part of a broader movement towards sustainable living, with handmade items celebrated for their uniqueness and durability. The revival during this time set the stage for knitting's evolution into the 21st century, where it would blend tradition with modern innovation. In the 21st century, knitting has been revitalized by technology, modern design, and social media. The rise of the internet brought with it a new generation of knitters who connected globally through online communities. Platforms like Ravelry, which launched in 2007, transformed the knitting world by allowing knitters to share patterns, techniques, and projects with a global audience. This digital knitting renaissance introduced knitters to a vast array of styles and materials, while also preserving traditional methods. Social media platforms such as Instagram and YouTube became hubs for knitting tutorials, knitting podcasts, and creative inspiration, opening the door for new knitters to learn and join the craft. Innovations in yarn production, such as eco-friendly and sustainable fibers, also gained traction as environmental consciousness grew. Knitters today have access to a vast selection of natural and synthetic fibers, each suited to different purposes, whether for fashion, function, or artistic expression. Modern knitwear designers have pushed the boundaries of what can be done with yarn and needles, blending old techniques with avant-garde aesthetics. As a result, knitting has firmly secured its place as both a traditional craft and a cutting-edge art form, continuing to evolve while staying rooted in its rich heritage.